It was the evening of April 18th, 1775. And Joseph Warren sent for Paul Revere. He instructed Revere to ride to Lexington, Massachusetts, to warn Samuel Adams and John Hancock that the British troops were marching to arrest them. These are the superstars of our own American history. These are the headliners. Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and of course, we know Paul Revere and the Raiders. This is a different Paul Revere. But we know who Paul Revere is. The headiness of that moment. Things are about to take place. Things are about to sort of break loose. After two companions rowed him across the Charles River to Charlestown, Paul borrowed a horse from his friend Deacon John Larkin. And while in Charlestown, he verified that the local Sons of Liberty had seen his prearranged signal. Does anybody know what that signal was? I heard a muffled cacophony, but I'm sure somebody said, "To if by sea." And on the way to Lexington, Revere alarmed the countryside, stopping at each house, and arrived in Lexington at about midnight. I looked on Google Maps, a modern-day authority, and the ride from Charlestown to Concord would take, I think, 20 minutes by car, an hour if you're riding on a bicycle, or 3 hours if you're walking. He stopped and he told everybody he could. And as he approached the house where Adams and Hancock were staying, a sentry said, "Don't make so much noise." "Noise!" cried Revere. "You're going to have enough noise before long, because the regulars are coming." He was joined by William Dawes, and they continued on toward Concord, and Samuel Prescott and joined them until the three men were arrested by a British sentry. Prescott escaped almost immediately, and then Dawes soon after. Revere was held a little bit, and then sometime later he was released. This is the start. It's sort of like the first domino, and everything started picking up steam in our own history. And that begins our history. The British are coming. The British are coming, that famous poem. In Advent, we prepare our hearts for the coming Christ child. There's symbols all around us to remind us to prepare and to realize God is with us. God is in the world. His arrival signifies the relationship that we have with God. His arrival is the reason we not only have the table of our Lord's Supper, but the reason we can gather at that table. And it's incredibly great news. And so we can proclaim with John the Baptist, "The Lord is coming, the Lord is coming, the Lord is coming." Sometimes it seems a little bit like John the Baptist is a first century Paul Revere. He was radical. He goes against the grain of society, and he really, talking about John the Baptist here, wasn't happy just keeping things the way they've always been, just because that's the way they've always been doing them. In the Gospel of John, we don't get all the honey and locusts and camel hair sport coat. I don't think that's what Matthew and Mark meant when they said he wore camel hair, not like the nice camel hair sport coat I used to have. That's the different picture of John the Baptist. In the Gospel John, we get this picture of someone who is almost meek, humble. A witness to the coming light of the world. He came to testify to the light so that people might believe through him. And he himself was not the light, but he came to tell others about it, to point people to the light, to share the light with the world. The true light, it was coming. Jesus' arrival is right around the corner, and John's trying to point it out to everyone, but they didn't want to listen. Too often, the answer is right in front of us. But we ignore it, and we turn back inward to ourselves. and we miss out on the real joy. It's like the scene in Bugs Bunny. Anybody seen Bugs Bunny where Elmer Fudd is going to hunt him some rabbit? And he looks down in the rabbit hole, and Bugs, of course, goes out another exit and circles back around and comes up behind him. And what's up, Doc? I don't know if you ever felt this way as a kid. He's right there, Elmer. Turn around, shoot him. You can have that rabbit stew you've been talking about. The answer was right in front of him. And the answer for us, of course, is Jesus. The answer is here. It is in front of us. It's plain as the nose on my face. I have a pretty noticeable nose. There's a kind of live theater in England that we had the opportunity to go see called the British Pantomime. It's not the same thing as miming or pantomime that we describe here. And it was really hard for our friends who we went to go to the show with to explain to us, because we thought, you seem awful excited to see a bunch of people silently pretending they're in boxes. Well, it's a totally different thing. It's an interactive style of theater where everybody in the audience shouts back to the performers. And the performance is dependent on the audience being involved. And one of the best things in the pantomime is they'll introduce the villain early on. And you as the audience are always supposed to shout out, he's right behind you! And of course, the character on stage willfully remains ignorant and will turn around slowly enough that the other actor can, of course, turn with them and remain out of sight. The answer is right in front of us. It's Jesus. We don't need to do all these things to make Christmas special. We don't need to overspend. We don't have to make this season into something that is super stressful. That's on us. That's our creation. That's what we do with it. We don't need to max out credit cards in the name of celebrating God incarnate. The truth is, God's with us. Christmas is simply a time to celebrate, acknowledging God with us, Jesus in this world. John was sent from God to testify to the light. And his story gets even more exciting when we go on down to verse 19. There we get to see this testimony, to see how the religious folks were missing the point. The religious people were saying, who do you think you are? What are you doing? John's trying to explain it, and he's trying to say it as clearly, as plainly as they can understand. I'm not the Messiah. I never said I was. I never claimed to be something I wasn't. It goes on to quote from Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3, a voice crying out in the wilderness. And then just to be clear, John adds, I'm baptizing just with water. It's just water, folks. But there's somebody standing here among you that you don't know. Someone special. Someone who I'm not even worthy to untie his sandals. In a few weeks, Advent, these candles, this time of preparation, will be over. And we'll gather in this sanctuary, Christmas Eve, at 5 o'clock, mark your calendars, to celebrate God with us, God in the world. Because God is always here, and we just need this reminder, this seasonal reflection to say, God is here. The Lord is coming. In the midst of our Christian lives, it's easy to forget that this annual celebration is a recognition that God is always with us. Jesus' birth is a one-time event, but we commemorate it year after year as a reminder. And it's a good reminder because we live in a dark world that sometimes doesn't serve up encouraging experiences. In fact, the daily lives, the daily events of our lives can drag us down sometimes. And I see that a lot of times at this time of year. People so frazzled, just looking like they just can't wait for it to be over. All this celebrating and joy. I've had enough already. I want to tell you about Mohi. A little story about Mohi. He was a Cherokee young man, and he participated in a rite of passage, the same as all young Cherokee boys becoming young men. Mohi's name, we would translate it as elk. But his experience is common with so many other kids. Mohi was playing an ajodi, which is a Cherokee game, a bit like stickball with his friends. And they're laughing and having a good time and whacking a little ball around, and their kids of different ages, and they're all gathered. And his friends stop, just kind of pause. And Mohi's got his back turned and thinks, I'm not sure, what's going on? Are they going to play a joke on me if I turn around? But then he feels on his shoulder his father's hand. And he knows, and his friends know, that it's time. His father says, come. The smile leaves his face. This is the feared rite of passage to become a Cherokee man. His father takes him to the edge of a little village and clearing and puts a blindfold on him and takes him into the woods. As they're walking along, he can hear the distant voices of his friends. And then it fades, and he listens intently to be able to hear familiar sounds so that he can orient himself. He knows that if he can hear the rush of the water, they're going to go toward the stream. But he doesn't, and his father's mastered that Cherokee ability to walk silently in the woods. His only guidance is an occasional nudge on his shoulder. Finally, they stop. His father says, sit. And he feels behind him, and he realizes his father is stopping right in front of a log. And he sits down on the log. He knows the routine, although nobody ever really sat him down and told him the routine. They've heard this their whole lives. He knows the rules, although no one necessarily told him the rules. But here's the deal as the best he understands it. He has to now sit on the log all night long, by himself, alone in the woods. He can't cry out for help. He can't do anything. He cannot remove the blindfold. But he knows that at some point, the following morning, the sunlight will be able to peek through the blindfold, and he'll be able to tell that the sun has come up. And only then can he remove the blindfold, and only then will he be a Cherokee man. He also knows, and this is an absolute rule of this rite of passage, he may not talk about it with other boys. At first, he was just bored. As a teenager, he was playing an ajodi, having fun with his friends, and now he's sitting on a log. But then his imagination started to creep in. I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but there's really nothing wrong. The wheels are spinning, and there's a million things wrong. Well, Mohi could concoct some things wrong. He started thinking about, I heard the neighboring tribe wasn't so happy with us. What if a exploratory party comes upon me? What if some kids followed my dad into the woods? And just his mind raced as he imagined horror after horror, and he began to get really afraid. And the darkness soon fell. And soon he didn't have to use his imagination to be afraid. He could hear nocturnal sounds. He heard a little animal or an animal creep by, and he thought, oh, please let that be a raccoon, a harmless little raccoon. But it could be a mountain lion. The wind picked up. And you could hear branches creaking. He had seen a tree fall before, and he knew that if a tree fell on him, or even a large limb, that would be it. His pulse just raced as he went along. Time and time again, he thought about crying out. He wanted to so badly, but he knew he couldn't. He knew the rule, not a sound. And then he began to get cold. On top of everything else, he was sitting there shivering. And any time the wind would abate, or an animal would stop, his imagination would kick back in. Fill in the blanks. Minutes seemed like hours. But then he realized he could see the glimmer of sunlight peeking through. Out of the corner of his blindfold, he could see the sunlight. Oh, I don't think you've ever heard such a sigh of relief. He reached up and he pulled the blindfold back. And his father was sitting next to him. We live in a dark world. Jesus is the light of the world. God with us. And when the blindfold comes off, he's there, watching us, protecting us, ever present. No matter what happens, God is with us, giving us a constant reason to have joy.